Ellie sat hunched over a weathered leather-bound book in the castle's archives, the musty smell of old parchment filling her nose. It was early morning, and the faint light of dawn filtered through the narrow windows, casting long shadows across the room. Her mind buzzed with questions, fueled by fragments of the dreams that had plagued her nights and the ghostly warnings of the drummer boy. She turned another brittle page, her fingers careful not to tear the fragile paper. The section she was reading chronicled the castle's tumultuous past, a tapestry of war, rebellion, and betrayal. One entry caught her eye: the Black Dinner, 1440. A feast of treachery that stained the stones of Edinburgh Castle with innocent blood. Ellie's breath caught. She'd heard the name before, whispered in the darker corners of Scotland's history, but she'd never delved into its details. Now, with the drummer boy's warnings fresh in her mind, the story took on a new significance. A feast turned fatal. The Black Dinner was a tale of betrayal, so chilling that it had seeped into the collective consciousness of Scotland, passed down through generations as a cautionary legend. It was a story of power and paranoia, and of how ambition could turn even the most sacred traditions into instruments of death. In 1440, James II of Scotland was a child, his throne controlled by regents who sought to secure their power. Among the most prominent families in the kingdom were the Douglas clan. Young William, the 6th Earl of Douglas, and his younger brother, David. The Douglases were powerful, their influence a threat to the ruling faction. The regents, fearing the rise of the Douglas family, invited the young brothers to Edinburgh Castle under the guise of a friendly dinner. They promised safety and camaraderie, luring the boys into a false sense of security. The feast began with grandeur, lavish dishes, flowing wine, and the laughter of nobles echoing through the great hall. But as the evening wore on, the atmosphere shifted. Servants brought out a single platter, covered with a black cloth. When the cloth was lifted, it revealed the head of a black boar, a symbol of death and betrayal. Before the Douglases could react, soldiers entered the hall, arresting the boys on charges of treason. The accusations were baseless, a pretext for eliminating a rival family. That night, both William and David were dragged into the courtyard and executed by beheading, their young lives extinguished in a moment of calculated treachery. The ghostly connection. Ellie leaned back in her chair, the details of the story spinning in her mind. The betrayal, the sudden violence, the innocent blood spilled. Was it possible that the drummer boy's warnings were tied to this dark chapter of the castle's history? She reached for her notebook, jotting down the key details of the story. The Great Hall, where the feast had taken place, was the same location where she and Callum had encountered the apparition. The courtyard, stained with the blood of the Douglas brothers, was directly beneath her feet. As she wrote, a faint drumbeat echoed in her ears. She froze, her pen hovering above the page. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a steady rhythm that seemed to resonate from the very walls. Ellie glanced around the room, her heart racing. The archives were empty, the only light coming from the windows and her desk lamp. Yet the drumming persisted, a quiet reminder of the boy who had haunted her dreams. "What are you trying to tell me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The sound faded, leaving Ellie alone with her thoughts. Retracing the past, determined to uncover more, Ellie sought out Fergus MacLeod, the castle's groundskeeper. She found him near the main gates, his weathered hands busy repairing a section of the stone wall. "Fergus," she said, approaching cautiously. The old man looked up, his expression wary. What is it now?" More questions about ghosts and goblins. Ellie ignored his tone, holding up her notebook. "I've been reading about the Black Dinner. Do you know anything about it?" Fergus's face darkened, and he set down his tools. "I know enough to tell you to leave it alone," he said. "That night brought nothing but sorrow to this place. The castle's never been the same since." "What do you mean?" Ellie pressed. Fergus hesitated, his gaze shifting to the castle's towering walls. "They say the spirits of those boys never left, that their cries still echo in the courtyard on cold nights. And as for your drummer boy, some folk believe he was there too." Ellie frowned, but the drummer's legend didn't begin until centuries later. Fergus shrugged. Time doesn't mean much to the dead. Maybe he's tied to all the blood spilled here. Not just one night. Ellie's stomach tightened. The idea that the drummer boy might be connected to the castle's collective suffering was both intriguing and horrifying. A haunting revelation. That evening, Ellie returned to the Great Hall, determined to feel the history of the Black Dinner for herself. She stood in the center of the room, imagining the scene as it had unfolded centuries ago. The flickering torchlight, the strained smiles of the regents, the innocent laughter of the Douglas brothers. As she closed her eyes, the air around her grew colder. The faint scent of roasting meat and spilled wine seemed to waft through the room, mingling with the sharp tang of iron. Then came the sound. It started as a low murmur, like distant voices carried on the wind. Gradually, it grew louder, the indistinct chatter of a feast in full swing. Ellie opened her eyes, her breath catching as she saw flickering shadows at the edges of the room. The shadows coalesced, forming ghostly figures seated around an ethereal table. They laughed and gestured, their faces blurred but their movements vivid. At the head of the table sat two boys, their youthful faces alight with joy and trust. Ellie's chest tightened as she recognized them from historical sketches. William and David Douglas. The scene shifted abruptly. The laughter turned to gasps and cries as soldiers stormed into the room. The boys were dragged from their seats, their pleas drowned out by the clamor of armored boots and shouted orders. Ellie watched in helpless horror as the table dissolved, replaced by the open courtyard. The boys knelt on the cold stone, their faces pale with fear. A soldier raised his blade, and Ellie turned away, unable to watch the execution. But the sound came anyway, the sickening thud of steel meeting flesh, the dull roar of the crowd, and beneath it all, the faint but steady beat of a drum, a warning in the present. Ellie awoke with a start, realizing she had fallen asleep at the edge of the Great Hall. The ghostly vision was gone, replaced by the dim, empty room. She sat up, her hands shaking as she tried to process what she had seen. The drummer boy's warning wasn't just about her or the castle. It was about the weight of betrayal and violence that had stained this place for centuries. As she gathered her belongings, a faint drumbeat echoed through the hall. It was steady and deliberate, a sound that seemed to say, "You're not finished yet." Ellie glanced toward the doorway, her resolve hardening. The drummer boy wasn't just a harbinger of disaster. He was a guide, leading her deeper into the castle's haunted past. And she intended to follow. The ghostly banquet. The Great Hall felt alive that night, though not in any way Ellie or Callum could have anticipated. The room, so often cold and empty during her previous visits, now seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. The flickering torches cast distorted shadows on the stone walls, creating a shifting tableau that made Ellie's stomach churn. She had returned to the hall, determined to confront the echoes of the infamous Black Dinner, hoping to unravel the ties between that treacherous night and the drummer boy's warnings. Callum, skeptical as ever, had reluctantly agreed to join her, though his confidence had worn thin since their first encounter with the boy. "If we see anything tonight," Callum muttered as they entered the room, "I'm charging double for emotional trauma." Ellie smirked, but her amusement didn't last long. The oppressive weight of the air silenced any further banter, and they moved quietly to the center of the hall. Ellie glanced at her watch. It was nearly midnight, the time when the veil between past and present seemed thinnest. She set her recorder on the stone table where the Black Dinner was said to have taken place, her fingers trembling slightly. "Do you feel that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Callum nodded. "It's colder than usual." The air was indeed frigid, and the temperature continued to drop as they stood in silence, their breath visible in the torchlight. Then it began, the banquet reborn. At first, it was subtle, a faint murmur, like the distant hum of a crowd. Ellie strained to listen, her heart racing as the sound grew louder, more distinct. Laughter, clinking glasses, and the low rumble of voices filled the hall, though it remained empty before them. Callum took a step back. "What the hell is that?" Before Ellie could respond, the hall began to transform. The cold stone table was suddenly covered with a shimmering banquet cloth, and spectral platters appeared, laden with ghostly food that seemed to shimmer and pulse with faint light. Ethereal figures began to materialize, their forms translucent but unmistakably human. Ellie recognized the scene immediately. This was the Black Dinner, reborn in horrifying detail. The room filled with spectral nobles dressed in elaborate 15th century garb, their faces animated with laughter and conversation. Servants flitted between them, carrying trays of food and wine. At the head of the table sat two boys, William and David Douglas. The sight of them took Ellie's breath away. The brothers were young, their faces bright with innocence and trust. They smiled and laughed, seemingly unaware of the doom that awaited them. "It's them," Ellie whispered. "The Douglas boys." Callum didn't respond. He was frozen in place, his wide eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. The turn of the feast. As the banquet continued, the atmosphere began to shift. The laughter grew strained, the conversations more muted. The nobles exchanged uneasy glances, their movements stiffening as the tension in the room became palpable. Ellie felt it too, a tightening in her chest, a sense of dread that seemed to seep from the very walls. She watched as a servant entered the hall, carrying a covered platter. The murmur of voices ceased, and the room fell into an unnatural silence. The servant approached the head of the table and placed the platter before the Douglas brothers. The younger boy, David, leaned forward curiously, but his older brother, William, hesitated. The servant lifted the cloth, revealing the head of a black boar. The nobles gasped, their faces pale with fear. Ellie's stomach churned. She had read about this moment, but seeing it replayed in spectral form was something else entirely. The black boar's head was a death omen, a symbol of betrayal and murder. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. The brothers' smiles faded as the reality of the situation set in. Soldiers entered the hall, their boots thudding against the stone floor, though their forms were ghostly and silent. The nobles shrank back as the soldiers advanced, their armor glinting faintly in the flickering torchlight. William stood, his youthful face a mix of anger and fear. He shouted something, words that Ellie couldn't hear, but the soldiers seized him and his brother, dragging them from their seats. The execution. The scene shifted abruptly, the banquet table vanishing as the room transformed into the castle courtyard. Ellie and Callum found themselves standing on the edge of the courtyard, their breaths visible in the frigid air. The spectral figures were there, too, gathered in a semicircle around the two boys, who knelt on the cold stone. Ellie's heart pounded as she watched the execution unfold. The soldiers raised their blades, and the older boy, William, held his brother's hand tightly. The swords fell, and Ellie turned away, unable to watch the horrific act. But the sounds filled the air, the sickening thud of steel meeting flesh, the gasps of the crowd, and beneath it all, the steady, relentless beat of a drum. The drummer boy was there, standing in the shadows at the edge of the scene. His headless form was still, his drum suspended from his chest. He raised his drumsticks and began to play, his rhythm mournful and slow, as if marking the passage of the brothers' souls. Ellie's knees buckled, and she grabbed onto Callum for support. "We have to stop this," she said, her voice shaking. "It's already done," Callum replied, his own voice hollow. The aftermath. The vision began to fade, the ghostly figures dissolving into the night. The courtyard returned to its empty, lifeless state, and the drumbeat faded into silence. Ellie and Callum stood in stunned silence, the weight of what they had witnessed pressing down on them like a physical force. "Did we just—" Callum began, but he couldn't finish the sentence. Ellie nodded. "We saw it. The Black Dinner. The betrayal. All of it." She sank to the ground, her hands shaking as she tried to process the experience. The drummer boy's presence lingered in her mind, his mournful rhythm echoing in her ears. "What does it mean?" Callum asked, his voice trembling. Ellie looked up at him, her eyes filled with determination. "It means the drummer boy isn't just a ghost. He's a witness, and he's trying to show us something." Callum crouched beside her. "But why us?" Ellie didn't have an answer. All she knew was that the drummer boy's warnings were growing more urgent, and the truth they sought was buried deep within the castle's dark and bloody past. The ghost child. Ellie had stayed behind in the great hall long after Callum left for the night. The vision of the spectral banquet was still vivid in her mind, the faces of the Douglas brothers haunting her every thought. She could almost hear the faint murmur of their laughter and the rustling of the soldiers' cloaks as they closed in for the betrayal. But there was something else, a nagging detail she couldn't shake. As the banquet dissolved into the courtyard execution, Ellie was certain she had seen another figure, a child, small and fragile, standing in the shadows near the edge of the scene. Unlike the other spectral forms, this one seemed different, aware. The castle was silent now, save for the occasional creak of wood or the distant howl of the wind. Ellie walked to the center of the hall, her footsteps echoing against the stone. She felt the weight of the room pressing down on her, the centuries of bloodshed and betrayal saturating the air. "Show me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "If you're still here, show me." The air grew colder, and Ellie's breath formed in ghostly puffs. Her skin prickled as the temperature dropped further, and a faint sound reached her ears, a child's laughter. A child in the shadows. Ellie turned sharply, her heart racing. The sound had come from the far corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to ripple unnaturally. She shone her flashlight in the direction of the sound, but the beam revealed only the cold stone walls. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing faintly. The laughter came again, soft and high-pitched, like a playful tease. Ellie's pulse quickened as she moved toward the source, her footsteps slow and deliberate. As she neared the corner, the air grew heavier, and a shape began to emerge from the darkness. It was a child, no older than 8, dressed in a simple tunic that seemed too large for his thin frame. His hair was dark and messy, and his face was pale, almost translucent. But it was his eyes that unnerved Ellie the most. They weren't vacant like the other specters she had seen. These eyes were sharp and piercing, filled with a mixture of sadness and knowing. "You're not supposed to be here," the boy said, his voice soft but firm. Ellie froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. Who are you?" she managed to ask. The boy tilted his head, a faint smile playing at his lips. "I'm someone who remembers, someone who watches." Ellie took a cautious step closer. "Did you know the Douglas brothers?" The boy's expression darkened, and he turned away, his form flickering like a flame. "They didn't deserve it," he said quietly. "None of them did." A warning from the past. Ellie's heart ached at the sorrow in the boy's voice. "What happened to you?" she asked gently. The boy didn't answer. Instead, he reached out and touched the stone wall beside him. The surface seemed to ripple under his fingers, and an image appeared, a fleeting glimpse of a room filled with children. They were huddled together, their faces pale and frightened, as soldiers loomed over them. Ellie's stomach churned. Were you there?" The boy nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the vision. "We were taken, locked away. They said it was for our safety, but it wasn't true." The image dissolved, and the boy turned back to Ellie, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "You're looking for answers," he said, "but some answers aren't meant to be found." Ellie's breath caught in her throat. "Why not? What are you trying to tell me?" The boy stepped closer, his small figure seeming both fragile and powerful. "The castle keeps its secrets for a reason. If you dig too deep, you might not like what you find." The child's game. Before Ellie could respond, the boy turned and began walking toward the far end of the hall. His footsteps made no sound, and his form flickered with each step. "Wait," Ellie called, hurrying after him. The boy stopped and glanced over his shoulder. "Do you want to see what I see?" Ellie hesitated, her instinct screaming at her to turn back, but curiosity won out. "Yes," she said. The boy's smile widened, but it was not a comforting expression. "Then follow me." He led her through the hall and into one of the smaller chambers that branched off from it. The room was empty, save for a few pieces of decayed furniture and a faint layer of dust on the floor. The boy stood in the center of the room and turned to face her. "Close your eyes," he said. Ellie hesitated again, but the boy's gaze held an authority she couldn't resist. She closed her eyes, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Now listen," the boy said. At first, there was only silence. Then, faintly, Ellie began to hear voices, whispers, muffled and indistinct. The voices grew louder, overlapping until they formed a cacophony of fear and anger. She heard children crying, soldiers shouting, and the rhythmic beat of a drum. The sound swirled around her, filling her mind with a torrent of emotions: terror, betrayal, and despair. "Stop!" Ellie cried, opening her eyes. The room was empty. The boy was gone. A chilling revelation. Ellie stumbled back into the great hall, her mind racing. She felt as though she had glimpsed something profound, something terrible. The child had shown her a piece of the castle's history, a fragment of its truth. Callum found her there an hour later, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his voice attempting humor but failing to hide his concern. Ellie glanced up at him, her face pale. "I think I spoke to one." Callum frowned and sat beside her. "What happened?" She told him everything: the boy, the vision, and the overwhelming sense of sorrow that had filled the room. "He knew I was there, Callum," she said, her voice trembling. "He spoke to me like he was alive, like he knew what I was looking for." Callum shook his head. "That's not possible. Ghosts aren't supposed to do that, are they?" Ellie didn't answer. She wasn't sure what ghosts were supposed to do anymore. All she knew was that the boy's warning had been clear. The answers she sought were dangerous, and the castle would not give them up easily. The drummer's lament. As they left the great hall, a faint drumbeat echoed through the castle. It was soft and mournful, a haunting reminder of the boy who watched and waited in the shadows. Ellie stopped and turned back, her eyes scanning the empty hall. For a moment, she thought she saw the child standing near the banquet table, his form flickering like a dying flame. But when she blinked, he was gone. "Let's get out of here," Callum said, his voice tense. Ellie nodded, but as they walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that the boy's presence was still with her. His laughter, his warning, and his sorrow echoed in her mind, intertwining with the drummer boy's mournful rhythm. The castle's secrets were unraveling, but the price of uncovering them was growing higher with each step.
Driving me.